Hello, everyone. Today's webinar is going to be on ICH Section 5, which is on the sponsor. So a little overview is that, just to kind of give you, to take a step back to go over some terms, is that the sponsor is the company that is making the medicine, typically, and they are running the clinical trials in terms of the responsibilities, but then they can hire out other people to help them execute this. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. And then the other term is the CRO, is the Contract Research Organization, which is the company that can actually kind of be at the site, the institutions, kind of running the study. And usually they have a team of CRAs who are the people who go out to the sites to look at how the study is progressing and make sure everything's happening safety-wise and everything's being documented. And so we will dive a little deeper into actually going into the ICH guidelines, and then we will kind of go over some terms and just see exactly what they have spelled out. All right, so we will go straight to the document. This is the ICH E6R2, and then it'll show addendum to show aspects that were added in R2. And but there's only been 2 updates, right? And so this is a significant document that clinical research relies on to conduct studies. So it's really important that we fully understand this document, and it will help you have a overall picture of who all the different players are within clinical research, and then also kind of what are the rules they follow, right? So this is kind of the guideline rules that most people follow, and this is applicable to any sort of countries that are following the ICH, but usually most companies or most countries just in the world rely on this guidance, and usually theirs might be kind of built a little bit extra on this, but this is kind of like the foundation that everyone works off of. So as we talked about, the sponsor is the company, and that's what we're going to dive in today on section 5. We went into the first section, which was kind of the glossary and all the different terms for clinical research. So feel free to go back and review those terms and or watch the videos that we have. Yep. All right. So this addendum area, this means that this has been added. So they've added as their first item a quality management system kind of update. And it just talks about making sure that you have quality systems to run your clinical trial. And then they've kind of added some kind of regulations on that, or kind of guidelines on terms of the different things that you should look for in your system and making sure that's good. So that's kind of where we start off with is quality aspect. And there's usually what they're saying is they're using the system to identify risk, right? So you have a process, you have data identification, risk evaluation, risk control, risk communication, risk review, and risk reporting. So those are all aspects of the system. And then to kind of continue on that, the next section is quality assurance and quality control. And they're still regarding kind of the aspect of managing your clinical trial here. And so they're talking about you have to have SOPs, and all of these have to be written and kind of highlight the data generation. And then they've talked about making sure that it's documented, right? Which is, we see this within clinical research that everything needs to be documented. And we're at Power of Work really trying to help people get into TMF jobs, but also overall like clinical research. And so you will see that with TMF, it's a specific process with the paper for kind of documenting the clinical trials, but there's a lot of aspects. Basically everything about the clinical trial should be documented, right? And so you'll see that throughout here, the emphasis for documentation, so that you can kind of see the importance of the TMF within this really important guideline. And so they're talking about making sure you have SOPs, and then the sponsor is responsible for making sure all the agreements for all parties to have direct access, and being kind of the gatekeeper of or delegating this out, but making sure that everyone who needs access has access. People who don't need access don't have access, right? So you don't want somebody to by accidentally be able to see patient information or be able to see how the trial is progressing. So that's something important. And then it's adding that quality control should be at each stage of any sort of data handling, right? So it's emphasizing how important this data is, because it's usually patient information and kind of what's happening with the patient as it progresses. And so they're in charge of agreements in general. And then, as we talked about, the contract research organization, the CROs, is a very common term. And the sponsor may transfer any or all of the sponsor trial-related duties and functions to the CRO, but the ultimate responsibility for the quality and integrity of the trial data always resides with the sponsor. So CRO can implement quality assurance and quality control, and they should, but this is a very important statement that you'll hear kind of throughout the industry, is because a lot of times people hire this organization to help do the work, and they don't always have the proper oversight and to make sure that they're still very aware of what's going on, because they do have the ultimate responsibility. So this is a term that this kind of sentence is I've heard mentioned many times, because people are constantly trying to remind themselves and other groups that, you know, you really need to know what's going on. While we can kind of delegate out aspects, it needs to definitely be managed and properly handled by the sponsor. So that's kind of, this whole section's about this, right? So they're saying that it needs to be documented, right? Usually there's a transfer of obligations form that specifies exactly what is being handled by the CRO. And they usually also have this kind of detailed in the contracts that happen. And then this is an addendum section, so we want to make sure that we always look at those addendums, because it's something that they find important to add. So sponsors should ensure oversight of any trial-related duties and functions carried out on its behalf, including trial-related duties and functions that are subcontracted to another party as the sponsor's contracted CRO. So this is basically kind of like the regulatory boards making sure that even if the sponsor says, oh, I hired a CRO, they were handling something, they're still responsible even if the CRO goes and hires somebody else. Because sometimes the sponsor will say, oh, well, no, it's the CRO's fault. But realistically, the sponsor needs to have oversight of everything, even if the CRO is supposed to be doing it and supposed to be like watching it, in the sense of maybe they've been delegated the task of, let's say, we could talk about TMF, right? So maybe the CRO that's being hired doesn't have its own TMF, and they've told the sponsor, we will handle the TMF. They go out and they contract with another group to handle the TMF. But while the CRO should be watching and making sure that this other group, basically like a mini CRO who's handling the TMF, should be doing their job, it always falls, the responsibility always falls on the sponsor. So the sponsor can't just say, oh, it wasn't my fault, I wasn't doing it. The sponsor is always responsible in making sure that everything's going smoothly, even if it's like been delegated out. That's something to note in your future clinical research careers, that this could happen where a sponsor says they're going to do, or a CRO says they're going to do something, and then they hire out somebody else. You want to make sure that you're just very aware of that, and that should be like documented in the contracts. And so that's a good question to ask during your bid defense, which is usually when you have multiple CROs present their proposal on how to run your study and how much it'll cost, right? So that could be something that you could ask, something to be aware of. Okay, so then kind of all similar aspects of this, but just the trial-related duties and functions that are not transferred need to be handled by the sponsor. And then all reference to a sponsor in this guideline applies to a CRO or to the extent that CRO has assumed the trial-related duties and functions of a sponsor. So basically, if later in this document they mention sponsor, it could also be the CRO is doing it, and kind of vice versa, right? Depends on what their being delegated out to do. And then medical expertise. The sponsor should designate appropriate qualified medical professionals. So basically saying that they can hire other people or they can have people on their team, but you need to make sure that you're running a clinical trial and it's regarding patients and safety. You need to have medical professionals involved, right? It can't just be a whole bunch of business people or data scientists. It needs to actually have some qualified medical people to make important qualified, medical decisions. All right, trial design. They'll go a little bit more into this later in the document, I think regarding the protocol aspect, but this is basically just saying kind of very similar that as you're designing the trial, you need to have qualified people doing this. And I have seen trials that are not designed well, right? So basically maybe just one person decides to kind of, okay, this is how I want to run the study. And if you don't have a big team of people who are very experienced running studies, they might say, oh, that sounds great. But realistically, you should have qualified people who've run studies, who knows what they're doing and knows specifically, like as I mentioned, biostatisticians, because if you don't have the right number of people, you might not be able to prove that your study is successful, right? Or you need to have a whole bunch of, it requires a team of people to make these decisions. And so it's basically saying that the sponsor needs to do that. They can't just kind of make up their own thing. It needs to be a kind of robust trial design. Okay, 5.5, trial management, data handling, and record keeping, right? Record keeping is TMF, and so we always want to perk our ears up when we hear this. Again, so making sure that qualified individuals to conduct the trial, handle the data, verify the data, and conduct statistical analysis and prepare the trial reports. And then we dove a little bit into this when we talked about this last night, but basically the Independent Data Monitoring Committee, the IDMC, is the group of people that help kind of manage, like if you think of the study in terms of like traffic lights, like a green light, red light, like they're trying to make sure that the study is going appropriately, and usually also has to do with safety. So making sure that this group approves the different sort of changes and things that are happening in the study. So if people are getting sick, they might say we need to pause this study to see if these people get even more sick or to investigate why they're getting sick. So they kind of have the ability to pause the study. And that's a lot of power if you think about it, because there are studies are very expensive to run, right? And so you have all these people and all these physicians working towards the success of the study. If you pause it, it kind of throws everything off, and when you can file for the drug to be approved. And so it's a big deal. There's a lot of power that this group has, and it's supposed to not be, as it says, independent. It's not hired by the sponsor. It needs to be somewhere else, kind of a separate group that can't really be influenced. All right, and then this next section, when using electronic data handling and remote electronic trial data systems, the sponsor should ensure that the documents that the electronic data processing system conforms to the sponsor's established requirements for completeness, accuracy, reliability, and consistent intended performance. So as part of like kind of like a validation process of your system. And it goes a little bit deeper into this and making sure that you have to have SOPs, and they cover not just how you're going to, usually you think about SOPs, your standard operating procedures, is kind of how you're going to use, but they need to also talk about how the system is set up, installed, and used, right? And the validation is making sure that everything is working according the way it should, right? And this is really important, especially when you have really important data, right? So it talks about having a backup for the data, security system, kind of access logs. And then if you do have, you are like a blinded study, that the blinding is a particular feature in there. And then we have an addendum here, which also might mean that it's a newer thing that they've thought of. So ensuring the integrity of the data, including the describe the content, context, and the structure, is particularly important when making changes to the computerized system, such as software updates and migration of data. So we've done TMF transfers, right? So you might be transferring TMF documents from one to another, and making sure that everything gets transferred appropriately. That can be an aspect of migrating data, right? So since the TMF is your data. And then a little bit further on that, kind of just continuing a similar vein, but just making sure that you use ambiguous study identification codes. So you don't want to put like the birth date of the patient, and that's how you are having their subject codes, right? Because the idea is to not be able to identify the patient. So you shouldn't be able to kind of like figure it out, right? So it should just be randomized number or just this ambiguous code. And then the sponsor and other owners of the data should retain all the sponsor-specific essential documents pertaining to the trial, right? And it'll talk about essential documents, which we actually covered a long time ago, but we can go into that again as part of this document. And then as we saw down here, it talks about 2 years, and we mentioned that this is, again, kind of the minimum, and this is if the studies are running off of these ICH guidelines for good clinical practice, right? So a lot of places have stricter, so that means that they need to keep the records for longer, but basically 2 years is the minimum. And then as we see later, even if they are closing it, they still need to have that 2 years, and then you also need to inform the sponsor in writing that you are that they need to retain the records, and then if they no longer need to retain the records, then they can they need to be notified via writing, right? So it's almost in a sense protecting the sponsor from the institution saying, oh, it's 2 years, I no longer need this, or the study looks like it was doing fine, I'm going to head and shred all these records, right? So there needs to be documentation, right, as we've talked about many times, and so the sponsor needs to inform the investigators in writing. So I try to go over that section quickly so that we could continue on. So this is the investigator section. So the sponsor is responsible for selecting the investigators, right? Now this is something that the CRO usually has a really, they usually provide good insight. Usually when I've been in bid defenses, the CRO will say, I know you guys are running an oncology, breast cancer study. We know a whole bunch. We've worked on tons of those studies, and we have a big database of all the different doctors we've worked with, and we know which doctors are really good, and we know which doctors are great at finding patients and are really engaged in the study. So we have our own list of stuff, and so that's usually one benefit to utilizing a sponsor. Is that they have that, or utilizing a CRO, is that they have that inside knowledge because they've been able to run a lot of studies, right? And so that's why the sponsor is responsible for it, but the CRO usually does provide insight on saying, okay, here's our top 20 picks. And the sponsor can go through and say, oh no, I've heard of this doctor, or I don't really like this doctor. We've used him before and he didn't really follow the protocol. We had issues, things like that. But ideally, the sponsor, the CRO is supposed to provide the recommendations to the sponsor. So they need to be qualified by training and experience and have the adequate resources, right? So that is something that you want to watch. You want to make sure that the investigators that sign up for the study aren't saying, yes, I'd love to run the study, but they don't have the resources, sometimes the space, right? They need to have additional closets and areas to store materials, even though nowadays a lot of things are digital, but that used to be a really big issue because you'd have these study binders that are like these big binders, and they'd have all these patients information, and especially kind of like an intake sheet for each visit for the patient, and so all that used to take up a lot of space, and so that was something that we find as an issue. Also, if they don't have the correct number of study coordinators who can help run the study and input data and do that kind of thing, if they need to have the right amount of resources to run the study, right? And the sponsor pays for it and provides them compensation, but you can have sites that might try to be like, oh, well, we can handle it, we don't need to hire new people, right? Or kind of ask for more resources, and so that's something to watch out for. And then you have an agreement, and the sponsor needs to provide the investigator institution with the protocol and the investigator's brochure, right? So we've talked about those two documents, and feel free to look in the glossary or look at the other videos to it's good for you to understand what all these documents are, right? So there are two particular documents that need to be provided from the sponsor to the investigator so that they are aware of what the study is and kind of how it's going to be conducted. And if they want to be involved, and kind of a lot of times if they believe in the medicine, right? The idea is the investigators are truly caring about their patients and they want them to do well, and they feel like this will help them, right? So if they believe the medicine will make a difference, and they usually are involved in the study. And then the sponsor should obtain the investigator institution agreement to conduct the trial with GCP, right? To comply with procedures for data reporting. So sometimes you can say, I need you to enter the data within 5 days, right? That helps the data be clean. But a lot of times you want to make sure you write that in your contract so that they need to actually do that. And they're going to permit monitoring, auditing, and inspection, right? So the monitors are the CRAs that come out to like watch the study and make sure everything's going well. And then towards the end of the study, there will be auditing and inspections, especially if the study is successful and they want to go on to ask for the drug to be approved, right? So it's important that the institution agrees to these, and then retain the clinical trial essential documents until the sponsor informs them the documents are no longer needed. So that right here, the 5.5.12, this is something we just read, right? They need to be informed, and they need to keep the documents until they're informed. And then the sponsor, they need to sign the protocol and confirm this agreement. Right, so let's just do a couple more. So allocation of responsibilities. Prior to initiating the trial, the sponsor should define, establish, and allocate all trial-related duties and functions, right? So everything should be organized. And we also see this on, like, you can think of this as a delegation of authority log, where we see that on the site side, right? So the PI will delegate the different responsibilities for running the study at his site or his or her site, right? But that's the same kind of thing needs to happen, but study-wide by the sponsor. Okay, compensation to subjects and investigators. So in general, before we dive into the actual wording, the idea is that you're trying to make a successful study and a successful drug, but people should not be coerced or kind of overpaid for things. So you don't want to, for example, if you have a deadly medication and you're trying to test something really crazy, you pay people a whole bunch of money, and people who are really desperate in their life might need that money for their family, so they'll like sacrifice themselves. Like, you don't want any sort of weird situation like that, right? So everyone should be paid fairly. You also want to make sure that the doctors aren't really doing it just for the money. They should be compensated for the time and, like we said, like the resources that go into it. But you don't want anything where they're kind of being coerced and it's thought like, okay, well, we're going to pay you a whole bunch of money, but you need to provide us like with good data or something weird, right? So there's now rules to make sure this doesn't happen. And there's also something called the Sunshine Act that makes sure that all this stuff for the US is reported and very transparent. All right, so let's dive into the language. If required by the applicable regulatory requirements, the sponsor should provide insurance and other like kind of legal financial coverage and the investigator institution against claims from the trials, right? So if anything happens, it's on the sponsor side. So they need to provide insurance. And usually the hospital will also have insurance, but you will have clinical trial insurance, which is expensive, right? Because things can go wrong. The sponsor's policies and procedures should address the cost of treatment for the trial subjects in the event of trial-related injuries in accordance to the applicable regulatory requirements, like what we just talked about. And the trial subjects receive compensation. The manner and method of compensation should comply with applicable regulatory requirements. So keep in mind that this document is for multiple countries, right? So they can't specify, oh, you can only pay your patients $100 per visit or something like that, because there's some people who might travel in far for the visit, or the visit might require multiple hours of their time, or it's a quick visit, right? So you don't know. This is just kind of a foundational document trying to provide the fact that you do need to have it documented and needs to be like within the regulatory kind of your country requirements typically. All right, 5.9, maybe we'll stop there, and then we can kind of go into the IRB later. Financing. The financial aspects of the trial should be documented in an agreement between the sponsor and the investigator/institution. So basically just everything needs to be very clear as we talked about, and as you kind of read through this document, you should get the vibe that a really important aspect is patient safety, protecting patients' rights, right? We talked about data and making sure that the data is correct and being managed correctly and kind of safeguarded. And then also throughout this document, you should see the emphasis for documentation, which is what the TMF does, right? The trial master file in general is about documentation, and you can see that within the study, there's a huge emphasis on making sure things are documented properly. And so it's a really important aspect. So I'll pause here and let's see if anyone has any questions. But thank you for joining us today. Any questions? All right, if not, that's totally fine. Feel free to think of other topics that you'd like to go over. I think it's really important to fully understand the ICH guidelines, and if we can, I'd love to go over each section. We've kind of done the glossary, and now I'm working through the sponsor section, but it would be good for all of us to actually read every line and really understand this document, because it applies to many aspects of clinical trials. So yeah, thank you everyone. Have a great day. Bye.